is fun. So I want to introduce Liz Kelly. When we started brainstorming topics and people that we could bring in from our community, I really saw this as an opportunity to bring Liz in. She was a former student of mine. She's been a longtime friend of mine. She's now a resident of Rumney. She's a graduate of Plymouth State University. She's also a graduate of the Conway School of Design in Massachusetts. She's involved here in our local community as a board member for Gardens for All, our community garden here in Plymouth. She's also the board chair of the Permaculture Association of the Northeast. And we work together. We do consulting work together. And I would say that even Liz was a beginner gardener at some point. And so I'll let
Still
her,
am.
I'll let her provide her own kind of introduction. But with that, Liz, do you want to say a few words before I pull up your slides, or should I go right there?
Why don't you go right in and I'll say a few words at the beginning of that.
Great. So I'm going to be sharing Liz's slides. And here we go. Here we go. There we go. Okay, all you.
Could you go to the next slide? Awesome. So thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Kelly, like Steve mentioned, and I am super excited to be here tonight to talk with you all about how to get started with gardening. And if you're already a seasoned gardener, which I know some of you might already have your own gardens established at home or have been practicing gardening in some way over the years, I still hope that this presentation will provide you with some additional tips and tricks. And we really want to make sure that this talk has a large chunk of time at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to try to keep this presentation as brief as I can, but also make sure that it's concise and informative as well. So I grew up in a family that had a large garden growing up, and I truly do believe that my affinity to the natural world began there. After my kind of teenage years, those drifting times that many of us are well familiar with, when I started college, I fell in love with plants and with the act of growing my own food. And I really especially saw the connection in the way that gardening could address so many larger issues in the world, like climate change, like food security, and even now related to COVID-19. Gardens not only make our families stronger individually as households, but also our communities more resilient, which is one reason why this was a primary topic that was selected for this roundtable series. Next slide, Steve.
Hold on one second. You're going to bear with me. I'm like managing participants too.
Sure. Okay. So during the past 8 years or so, which I know isn't super long, I'm sure that some people on this call may have been gardening for a lot longer than I have, and have their own, tips and ways of doing things. But for the past 8 years or so, I've spent time working on organic farms in Virginia and North Carolina, and experimenting on my own in gardening at different places that I've lived. I really understand the unique challenges of gardening when you don't have access to land of your own and have to find creative ways to produce food in whatever space that you have available to you. Currently, I rent an apartment in Rumney, and so my landlord has given us a large portion of their garden to use. And I also have both annual and perennial food production space at the Plymouth Community Garden as well, which Steve mentioned that I was pretty involved in. And one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that you really can start a garden anywhere, which was a really empowering thing to learn. I knew that somewhat intuitively, but to actually practice growing food in a variety of different spaces and to recognize that on a more practical level was, again, really empowering. So whether the space you have is a back deck, such as this left-hand photo here, that can fit merely a few pots or some type of container gardening structure, whether it's a shady corner of a yard, all the way on the right-hand side, when I was living in Keene, New Hampshire, what you see in this picture was basically the only yard space that we had. And so it was a spot that was super shady from a really large maple tree from the neighboring yard, and also the shade from the house as well. And so we were able to grow salad greens fairly successfully there. So no matter, even if it's not sort of that, you know, large open grassy lawn or, you know, fielded area that people typically think of, such as the middle picture, starting kind of an annual plot in, that food can really be grown in any of these spaces. Next slide, Steve. So what I wanted to share with you all tonight is just a little bit about process, right? So I pretty much go through the process that I'm sharing with you all pretty much annually when I am restarting my garden or restarting kind of my gardening journey in the springtime. And so for me, step one is always identifying your gardening goals. So again, I do this yearly when I prepare for the gardening season. When you garden, you're always experimenting, you're always learning what works for you and what doesn't. And you learn really quickly what practices or what you're growing that maybe wasn't super useful, or it didn't give you a very high yield that you're like, that was a lot of time and energy. I don't want to spend that time and energy again this year. Sometimes you do want to spend it and try to refine that methodology and actually get better at it. So that experimentation never stops. It's a pretty much lifelong process. Sometimes your circumstances also change, which allows you to put less or more time into gardening. So for example, for me this year, the coronavirus pandemic has allowed more time for me to spend in the garden. So I'm expanding my growing space. I'm choosing some crops that I've never grown before, that I've always seen as being a little bit more time intensive. I'm choosing to grow those this year since I have that extra time. For some people, they might have less time because of the pandemic. And all of that kind of goes into our planning decisions in terms of what we're going to select to grow for the following year. Or at least in my opinion, it should, because I've had gardens in the past where I haven't planned very much, and oftentimes it's a lot of work and not a lot of yield. So that planning process is so important to making sure that it's a good experience for you, and that you get as much as you can out of that garden that you're able to put in. So one of the first questions I typically ask is, what do I want to grow? Another way to reframe this is, what do you like to eat? And sometimes they are two slightly different answers. Sometimes what I really like to eat might be harder crops to grow. So that's often part of kind of the planning process as well. For some people, they really like fresh summertime fruit. And so they see their backyard as being planted with blueberry and raspberry shrubs, maybe a strawberry patch, maybe rhubarb, which you can see blueberries and rhubarb are both pictured in this slide here. For some people, they're thinking more on the easier, smaller scale side. So maybe it's spinach, maybe it's lettuce, mesclun mix. Those types of crops don't take as long to germinate. You can grow them in a variety of different kind of site conditions. And to me, they're super, super easy for beginning gardeners to grow. For some people, it might be medicinal herbs is a particular interest to you. You can see chamomile with the white little flowers at the bottom of the screen. And some people are particularly curious about that. So really kind of taking some time and thinking about what you want to grow in your space can lead you to make some appropriate decisions about you know, what would be the best type of space, the best type of garden bed, etc. And then often I ask myself, how much time do I have to garden? Some crops are going to be more maintenance is going to be required to maintain them. I like to think of them as finicky. Some crops are more finicky. They like more love and attention, whereas some you can sow the seeds, let them go, they'll do their thing, and usually something will come up even without you having to weed them very much or having to put some TLC into that area. And then the last is, what are your desired impacts of your garden? So for some people, having a high yield of whatever you're growing is really important to them, whether it's a high yield of fruiting crops, whether it's root crops for storage, whether it's always consistently having salad greens for your dinner table all throughout the summer. For some, it's merely just a way to connect with the natural world, just a way to get outside, and yield might not be as large of a priority. For some, it might be just connecting their children to nature. So every single person is going to have a slightly different, you know, desired impact for what they want their garden to yield for them. And so that's another way that we can think about how to identify our goals. Next slide, Steve. Awesome. So selecting a location. So essentially, to me as a designer, so my background is in ecological landscape design. And so for me, whenever I'm starting a new garden from scratch, or if I'm improving my existing garden or even expanding upon the garden that I already have, I'm really looking at the baseline conditions of what's on my site. So one of those questions could be, do you own the land that you're on, or are you renting? That will sort of guide some of your decision making. What are the general characteristics of the property? Do you have particularly shady areas? Do you have sunny areas? Where do you have a water source available? So do you have a spigot? Do you have a well? Do you have any roof area that could potentially be used to harvest rainwater? Oftentimes what I'll do is I will make a very general site map of my property, and this can be done just by printing out a zoomed in view of Google Maps. It can be super, super simple, where you just use the snipping tool, and you can even use PowerPoint or something like that to just make notes on this little map of your yard. That just kind of identifies some of these general characteristics. It's a really good kind of planning tool for deciding what you want to grow in certain areas or where you want to expand your gardens. I like to use this phrase, right plant, right place, oftentimes. And so it really, that phrase in particular is kind of focused on how we lay our plants out in a way that makes sense with the conditions of our site, whatever that site is, whether it's a community garden plot, whether it's our own backyard, whether it's a deck even. So most plants want as much sunlight as they can get for the most part, but especially planting fruiting crops in some of your most sunny areas of your site, where it gets approximately 6 to 8 hours, usually is going to be a very good decision. And then planting some of your leafier crops like kale and chard, which can tolerate less sunlight, 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, and I've even seen less, honestly, is also a sort of a decision that you can make that takes into account that right plant, right place philosophy, I guess. I also consider that when I'm actually deciding like what plants I'm planting in each of my rows. So planting taller crops on the north side rather than the south side to maximize the amount of sunlight that each of those plants are going to get, and minimizing the amount of shading. I also want to note that sometimes you can arrange your plants though in a way that if you actually want to create additional shade so that you can grow plants that don't want to be in the sun all the time, such as like I've planted a row of taller crops like sunflowers in the middle of my garden so that the north side is extra shady, and some of my arugula, and I've even been able to grow spinach later into the growing season by just creating that shadier microclimate by planting those taller crops in the middle like that. So thinking about kind of that structure of that vertical hierarchical structure can be effective too. And then obviously for me, I feel like one of the biggest lessons I've learned is starting small has been a big, that has been a really humbling lesson, especially because during my first few years of gardening, I was starting, I was using a really large plot, and I noticed that I was kind of spreading myself thin to some degree to try to manage and really identify what was happening with each of these crops in these different areas of the garden. And starting small is such a good way to like refine your skills in kind of the most efficient way. And obviously considering irrigation is such an important part when you're selecting a location for your garden, or whether you're expanding your gardens. In terms of irrigation, again, whether you have that well or your water spigot, whether you have sprinklers, like if you're planning on using a sprinkling system, whether you're planning on using a watering can, or whether you're setting up some type of a drip irrigation system, which I highly, highly, highly recommend. It's my favorite irrigation system by far. Or whether you're using some type of like a hose with a wand. Pretty much any of these will work, but a lot of it will have to do with how much time you want to spend watering, whether you want some type of a timer. A lot of times you can set up drip irrigation systems with timers. And so how automated do you want it to be so that you don't have to put as much work into it? Or, if you rather have that time where you can go out and spend with each of your plants and actually use a watering can and kind of check on them and see how they're doing. So everyone is different in that regard. And then considering annuals and perennials is another big piece of this. If you're really interested in growing fruit trees, where you plant them, it's probably going to be a more permanent area, whereas some of your annual production space could shift The beds could potentially be reshaped. They could change a bit over time. So that's another kind of important piece when you're thinking about location, is that if you're going to plant those fruit trees, you're probably not going to want to move them again. So next slide, Steve. Okay, so before digging in, throwing your seeds in the ground or in your pots, I really invite you all to think a bit more deeply about the design of your space, of your gardening space. So the primary components pretty much, and I know that there's probably, I'm oversimplifying this to some degree, but the primary components of any garden are the garden beds itself. So you can see that in this case, whether it's containers, whether it's raised beds, whether it's in-ground beds, such as the first and the third photo, that's a primary part of any type of a garden. Pathways, or access points for harvesting and weeding and adding organic material. I really like to lay down cardboard and some type of mulch for my pathways. So as you can see in the third picture here, straw is laid down over potentially cardboard, and so that suppresses weeds, which I find to be a lot easier for me when I'm managing my garden. And it just keeps the weeds at bay in general, which I really like. And that cardboard can essentially just decompose and contribute to the kind of carbon into the soil later. So oftentimes I'll have to like re-add that cardboard every year or so, but and then materials. So you can see in this picture, there's a variety of materials that are present in front of us, whether it's mulch, such as that straw that I already mentioned, whether it's compost, whether it's siding or containers themselves. So I say siding, when I say siding, I mean the materials that are required for raised beds, for example, such as in the last picture on the right. Trellising systems, whether you're growing any kind of peas or cucumbers or anything that's going to require vertical growing space or does well with vertical growing space. And then fencing as well. So any kind of protection that we need from those who are going to munch on our crops. And then some people like a more linear layout. Some people like curved. I've always been a really big proponent of the curved layout because I personally like that as a more artistic person. However, there's a reason why so many gardens are laid out in a linear way, because they're really efficient. Really, they are. And you can have a curved kind of garden layout and still have it be efficient. I just feel like it kind of requires a little bit more finesse and planning and sometimes even experimenting. Next slide, Steve.
And Liz, just a time check, you're about 20 minutes in.
Okay, cool. I'm going to try to go through these quick then.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the different garden bed options that you can consider this year potentially when you're thinking about planning your own garden. So raised beds is a really, really common method. Typically, we'll often see raised beds as 4x8. They are relatively easy to build once you build one. I've included some of the materials on this slide. It would be actually, since this is going to be recorded, I don't know if we're going to be able to send out this PowerPoint to anyone or post it, but some of these materials are captured on the slide itself, and that includes something to actually hold the soil in, the soil mix itself. So for me, often for raised beds, I'll do a mix of compost, topsoil, and some type of aerating material like peat moss or coconut coir, or even perlite does work. Your seeds and plants, and then mulch. So you can mulch around your any of the plants that you're growing in there, so that that mulch will retain moisture and suppress weeds. So relatively simple material list to be able to build a raised bed or two in your yard. Next slide, Steve. So the next method I wanted to just talk very briefly about. So most people, when they are creating and maintaining a garden, the primary method that they will use is tilling the soil with a rototiller or some other type of machinery like that. While tilling a garden bed can be helpful initially to create a growing space by aerating the soil and preparing an area for planting, at least for myself, I recommend transitioning tilled gardens to low or no till gardens over time. And so this can be achieved well by sheet mulching, or some people know the kind of method by lasagna gardening. And so tilling over time causes compaction. Um, and it's also more work for us to till the soil annually, and it disrupts the soil biology and the soil ecosystem. And so while tilling a garden in order to get it established in a lawn could be beneficial over time, I think there's a lot of benefits that can be gleaned by transitioning to a no-till system. Next slide, Steve. Awesome. So I just wanted to like put in a super compressed time, I know, the like really basic process of what that kind of looks like, because most people, if they've never heard of that methodology of a no-till gardening system, don't really know what that looks like. So essentially this method can be used to transition a tilled area to a no-till area, or to start new garden beds by scratch in a grassy lawn. So this process can include, usually in the spring or the fall, to kind of mow the garden area, and then essentially to layer material on top of each other. And so typically you can see in the right-hand side of the slide, that little diagram. So oftentimes it will start with cardboard, which acts as a weed barrier, and then you can layer compost and mulch on top. Oftentimes people will also add other types of soil amendments that will help enrich the soil as well. And you can add that compost and mulch on top, and essentially every year you're building up that organic matter every single year. So essentially you're sheet mulching every year in those spots to build, at least with the compost and mulch, to build those kind of permanent in-ground beds. And I can also answer more questions about that method too during the Q&A if we want to, but Steve, will you go to the next slide? Awesome. And then containers. Containers are great if you're really limited with space. I do not like containers very much if you have access to space, because they dry out so fast. I feel like I'm always watering them when I have my container garden that is active. However, there's certain crops that do really well in containers, like tomatoes, like kitchen herbs, basil, and thyme, and you know, dill and parsley. They all do fine in pots. So keep that in mind too when kind of choosing plants for a container garden. Next slide. I just wanted to just note that if you can't garden at home, there's a lot of different opportunities locally, and if you're not local as well, there are pretty much community gardens in most communities nowadays, or at least in a neighboring community, but we still have some plots available at the Plymouth Community Garden if anyone is interested. It's just also a really great way to connect with people and to be able to kind of share gardening knowledge together, which I really like about it. Next slide. Awesome. So in terms of sourcing plants and starting seeds, so basically when you plan out your garden and you decide what you're going to plant in it, you can basically do two things. You can either start seeds yourself and grow them into transplants, right, which means that they're big enough to go into the ground, or you can direct seed crops, so you can actually sprinkle the seed over your garden and the plants will grow up, right? So different plants will do well in a garden at the transplant stage, and some prefer to be direct seeded. Beets and carrots and salad greens and things like that like to be direct seeded, whereas transplants, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, they would rather be transplanted in the garden rather than sprinkled by seed. So starting seeds indoors, I've already begun starting my own seeds. It's not too late. You can definitely still start seeds now, whether that's kale or chard. You can look on the back of seed packets, and it basically says how long it takes for seeds to germinate and how long it will take for them to grow before you put them out into the garden. So if you've been wanting to experiment with it, I highly suggest doing that. Especially with things that do not take as long to germinate and to grow, such as ones that are maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So I've included some sort of general materials on this slide, but we're going to go to the next slide. Awesome. I just want to like emphasize again how much gardening really is growing the soil, just as much as it is growing the plants itself, and it's almost synonymous with each other. And so I just wanted to highlight that testing your soil somewhat regularly at the beginning or at the end of the season can be really helpful. You can do that through UNH Cooperative Extension. Most other universities in other states also have their own version of that, where you can pay to have your soil tested. You can also buy a kit essentially through, you know, Amazon or Gardener Supply or other types of garden companies that will give you some information on how much organic matter content is in your soil, what your nutrient levels are, and that can be really helpful in deciding what your amendments are going to be. And then compost and mulch, so important to me. They always be putting compost and mulch on your garden every single year. That is just going to further improve your soil. And then I've kind of already mentioned the amendments, which typically gardening amendments allow us to make sure that we have the right amount of phosphorus, the right amount of potassium, those kind of nutrients that we need to have in our soil in order for plants to grow. And then there's a lot of different opportunities that we can use on like a backyard scale to create organic fertilizers using plants like stinging nettle and comfrey. You can create a tea out of those that are really highly nutrient and actually use that on your plants. Fish emulsion, seaweed fertilizer, all really, really good plant food. All right, next slide.
Sorry, Liz.
No worries, you're good.
And just so you know, we're getting some really good questions that are starting to come into the chat. So
awesome. I'm gonna wrap it up soon. I know that I'm probably over, so I'm gonna wrap it up.
We're asking you to do the impossible.
So I just wanted to make a note of just what I think some of the easiest crops are to grow that to me are almost fail-proof. So like salad greens, like for a long time I didn't have any kind of a seed starting setup, and like salad greens, spinach, kale, Swiss chard, all that I could just like throw seeds out wherever I was in whatever growing medium, container, in the ground, whatever, they would grow. So it's nice to just have some. Same thing with peas and beans. They would usually grow if I just kind of put them in the ground, and even if I didn't have much time, resources, or money to spend into adding additional kind of TLC into them, usually I would get a harvest from them. Even like summer squash, sunflowers, borage, calendula, which are some really popular flowers. I've had great luck with growing those from seed directly in the garden, even starting them super late in like mid-June, and I still get them to pop up and they'll bloom. Next slide. And then I also want to just touch on succession planting, because it's something that I didn't do at all when I was a beginner gardener, and now it is a primary part of my planning. So essentially, succession planting means that you're starting certain crops. You're basically staging. So you're starting maybe the same crop multiple times during a season, whether that's beets or carrots or salad greens, so that you have different, you know, when one crop is ready to get pulled out, like carrots, you already have another crop that is beginning to grow and mature, and you'll be able to pull your second harvest maybe a few weeks later. And so to me, that makes it so that you don't start and then you pull it out and you're like, I'm done, like, woohoo, that was great, now I have the rest of the season where I'm not eating this crop anymore. So it allows you to actually like realize those, in my opinion, dreams of being able to supply your own food throughout the season, like throughout that full growing season. Next slide. And then, so one of my projects that actually we just created in my household was we just built our first cold frame, which was really exciting. A cold frame is one season extension method that we can use in our cold climate of New Hampshire, where we have a shorter growing season. We can use both of these methods that I show on the slide, a cold frame, which is on the top, that top photo, and then also using Rumney, which is that white covering material on the bottom left-hand side of the slide, with those just kind of those hoops essentially. It protects our plants from the cold, and it creates a little bit of a warmer microclimate for them. For myself, with the cold frame that we just built, we have salad greens growing in there and spinach, and it just enables us to grow a little bit more on either end of spring and fall. And so I highly recommend, if that is interesting to you, there's so many great resources online to look at how to build a cold frame inexpensively. So, all right. Next, Steve. Phew. No, that was a lot, so.
So I'll stop the share, right? Liz, you can see the chat, right?
Yes.
You'll see there's been a lot going on. And so let's see, our first question was from Courtney, and it came in at like 7:29. I'll give you a chance to read it. And Courtney, feel free to, if you want to unmute yourself to be part of the discussion, you're welcome to, or I can do that for you.
I did it.
Oh, there you go.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi.
So one of my favorite resources that I've been using to figure out and kind of like plan in my own notebook of just like when I start seeds, when do I plant them in the ground? So High Mowing Seeds,
Mm-hmm.
they're a seed company in Vermont. They have a really good planting calendar.
Mm-hmm.
So it
I think
basically
I
says
bought a
like,
bunch of their seeds, but I
yeah,
think
yeah. So it's like a place where like it's basically a list where like they have all their crops listed out. They say like when you essentially should start them, when you should transplant them. Most of the plants, most of the information about when to bring plants out is pretty broad. Like oftentimes it's like after last frost.
right. And this year's a little crazy. That's why I'm freaking
Yes.
out because my
Yes.
daughter and I, like, we started like weeks ago. We started with all the seedlings. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. I'm like, why does it keep snowing? Like, we're so off track here.
I
So
know.
we're like ahead of the game with some of our like seedlings and stuff because some of our tomato plants and our kale is growing, our um salad greens and stuff is all growing. I'm like, we're not going to be able to get it into the ground. So right now they're in containers, which I know is fine, but I'm just worried about the timing just because
Yeah.
this year is like really off. And I just want to make sure that even though like we have a plot at the community garden, which isn't open yet, that we're still going to be good to go, that it's fine.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point. I feel like, especially when it's really wacky weather, we're
Mhm.
all kind of just like holding our breath and crossing our fingers. And we're like, hopefully we don't get snow in like late May because it has been kind of weird with how we've been getting snow. To
Mhm.
me, it feels like a little bit more sporadically and later than we typically have. Um, but usually, what the Farmer's Almanac and all these other resources say is that for us where we are in central New Hampshire, and within our zone, is that usually by Memorial Day we're good to go.
Mhm.
Sometimes with certain crops I will wait like a week or two from there. Sometimes with like winter squash I will, or there's certain crops I'll wait a week or two just to be sure. um, but typically, at least in my experience, I've been okay. And if there are predictions for cooler weather, I can always cover them
Okay.
with some type of like blanket or some type of cloth.
Mhm.
If I do worry that there is going to be a spike down in temp. Steve, do you
Okay.
have any thoughts on that as far as setting seeds, setting out transplants in an appropriate timeline?
No, I think you covered it. The only other thing for locals here that Josh Trott taught me years ago is that if you still see snow on the top of Mount Moosilauke,
Yeah.
you should not have plants outside. um, and I think someone from the Baker River Valley had shared that with him, and it's generally been true.
Yeah.
I did see the other question you had, Courtney, about direct sowing seeds. I have done some of that myself. Partly it depends on what you have sowed outside. If you put basil outside, it probably didn't work. But
Right.
I know my peas have been out for a while and they're just starting to come up. And
Mhm.
some carrots and some dill and things. And I haven't seen anything yet, but those are crops that can go in direct seed in colder conditions. And they'll kind of just sit and hang out, waiting for the right soil temperature
Mhm.
to take off. Wouldn't you agree, Liz?
Okay.
I totally agree. Yeah, and there's certain herbs that really like to be direct seeded, like dill. Dill loves to be direct seeded. Parsley and cilantro does really well when you just throw them on the ground.
That's what I
Like
did. All of
like
that.
you mentioned, basil, not so much. Basil's just a little finicky in that way.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I agree. Like oftentimes they'll just wait. Like they'll just
Okay.
kind of as seeds, they'll just wait and kind of just wait it out essentially. So it might be a little bit slower. Like you won't see that like, oh, in 10 days it'll germinate. It might be a little bit slower, but
Okay.
oftentimes you'll still see something come up.
All right. I'm going to be patient then.
Be
Patience is key
patient. You're
here
doing the
right
right
now.
thing.
All right. Thank
Um,
you.
you're welcome. So we had a question from Peter.
Yep.
How do you know when a seedling is okay for planting outside? So some of what we just talked about.
That's such a good question though.
Peter, do you want to expand on your question?
Well, I seem to always get it wrong. So I mean, it's either I get it in too early and it's not healthy enough, I guess. I
Yeah.
don't know whether it's healthy or not, and it dies, or I wait until it's all stringy and then it sort of just doesn't like that either. And it just seems like there's this magical moment.
Do you ever harden them off, Peter?
What does that mean?
So hardening them off essentially means like acclimating your new seedlings to the stresses of moving into a new environment. So
So
some
taking them
people will
outside?
they'll use a fan
Okay.
So if they have a seed starting setup, they'll actually use a fan, and that air circulation will somewhat mimic a hardening off period.
Okay.
Some people will actually also take their flats once they're at a certain size and bring them outside for a few hours if it's a warm, sunny day, just so that they can like feel the air, right? They're kind of like us, you know, like humans. Like they like feel a little strange when they're in a new environment, and they kind of get a little weaker. They're a little confused. And so sometimes acclimating them even for a few hours and then bringing them back in strengthens them, it toughens them up a little bit. So
Okay.
I've had good success with doing that.
And I have a quick follow-up. I read Rock Soil Hope, it talks a lot about no-till farming.
Yeah.
And I'd really like to try that. So basically everything's starting above, like, do the roots go below the cardboard, or is that where they stop?
They can. So like over time, the cardboard essentially, it acts as a really good weed suppressor at the beginning when you need it to, right? Like you need it to act as like, you know, smother and kill the grass underneath, for example.
Okay.
But over time, it will so if anyone's gardened with cardboard before, they'll know that even between a season or even during one season, it starts to break down. It starts to get wet. You can essentially plant through cardboard that you put down in May in October. You can plant right through it. It's like easy to kind of break apart.
And there's
Over
certain
time, that will just continue to add carbon to the soil, and you'll be able to do more in terms of like getting under there and in there, and the plant roots will be able to too. Steve,
But
do
I
you want to
imagine
talk to that as well?
I imagine there's certain things I can't grow, like carrots. You know, like and things that would want to grow down and in. I probably can't grow right away, right?
No, those are harder.
Yeah.
Those are harder, but you can get creative with your sheet mulching and leave areas around a row.
Yes.
So Peter, if you think back to, 10 or 12 years ago when you were so focused on those solar hot water installations and I was the guy picking up all the cardboard and driving it away.
Right.
All I was doing.
Right, I'll take that. Right.
Yeah, I was just sheet mulching the whole yard. So it's really effective. Start with a small section.
Yeah.
Right.
See how it goes.
That's what I recommend too, is starting with a small section, because we're in the process right now of doing that, of transitioning our tilled garden right now to no-till, and we're kind of doing it in stages just so we can see what sequence of steps is working best for us.
Right.
Yeah, so much of it is experimentation, especially with growing annuals.
Right. I did go too big a long time ago, too quickly. And
yeah.
I didn't have time, so it all went away. So I need to start making it back in.
So we have another question, Liz.
Yeah. So I do have a comp resource. So I just bought some. I can't plug this this nursery enough. It's not local per se. It's in Maine, Edgewood Nursery. This guy Aaron Parker, who owns and operates this nursery, focuses on edible perennial plants and other types of perennials that are really multi-beneficial for gardens. So comfrey is one plant that to me is one of those like magic plants. It's a beautiful plant that has great foliage, velvety, kind of soft, not softer, it's a little scratchier, but like beautiful bright green leaves, pollinator flowers. It can be used to make medicinal salve, the leaves, and you can chop and drop the leaves and leave them in your garden to essentially decay, and those leaves are filled with trace nutrients. So they're pretty high in calcium and a variety of other trace nutrients that are really good to have in your soil. So they can act as kind of like a living mulch in that way. And they can also be used to make, like, if you soak the leaves in water over weeks and kind of let them ferment, it can be used to make like a liquid fertilizer. So Edgewood Nursery has comfrey, the last time I checked. They also have a variety of other kind of really cool perennial vegetables and fruits and herbs that I think are kind of unique and fun. So I recommend checking them out.
I think Johnny's has comfrey, and I did, in full disclosure, tell Sarah that I would give her some, because I have anyone who's local. I put our contact information in the chat.
Yes.
If you're looking for comfrey, I'll give you the warning.
Steve has a lot.
Yeah, I have tons, but once you put it there, you will have it forever. You'll never get rid of it. So just think about where you're putting it, and make sure that it's you want all the things that Liz just mentioned. But don't
put it in an area that you're gonna till.
No, you'll have a
Because
zillion.
it'll spread.
It looks like the next question was from Sandra about the use of wood chips for mulching.
Yeah. Let me just go up to that question. Okay.
Do's and don'ts.
Right, wood chips. So I like ramial wood chips. I don't know about you,
kind?
Steve. So essentially, these wood chips are made from smaller diameter saplings, essentially. So they're typically a little finer. They break down a little bit more easily. Oftentimes, I don't see people use wood chips as mulch for like vegetable gardens and stuff, unless they're like no-till, pathways and things like that. Just because I don't think they break down as much over time. It takes them a little bit longer, essentially. Whereas like straw, totally different in terms of how it breaks down. But those ramial wood chips are nice, I think, for a top layer for that reason.
They're hard to find though. I mean,
they can be hard to find. It just depends on kind of who you know as far as like a tree company. Sometimes like someone will actually have their own wood chipper. I remember hearing a talk from Will Bonzel, who's a really awesome farmer who wrote a book you can get on Chelsea Green, Will Bonzel's Self-Sufficient Gardening Guide. Really amazing, has been doing this for like 50 years. Him and a few neighbors actually went in together to get like a wood chipper type shredder. They found that they were using mostly leaves as mulch for their garden because that's what they had an abundance of in their neighborhood. And so when they went in on it together as multiple families, it was a lot more affordable. But oftentimes it'll be someone with like their own kind of chipper that has, that type of diameter wood around.
I just got a shipment today from a friend that's in the tree business. And I was thinking that same thing because the chips were bigger than I thought. And I was about to put it around my garlic and I thought, I better ask this question tonight because it just looked like it could keep moisture from going in the ground. So
have you?
So you don't recommend it then for around vegetables?
Have you used wood chips for garlic, Steve? I've always used straw. I've never used.
No, I think for the reasons that you cited, I think if anything can handle it, the garlic could. If that's
maybe I'll try.
If that's a garden bed that you're going to then want to use for something else next season, you're going to find there's still quite a few wood chips there.
Yeah.
They won't break down in a calendar year.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's the problem then.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Year.
That's why they're really good for walkways and for weed suppression in places around perennials. The fact that you have a mix of hardwood and softwood is great. The softwood stuff breaks down faster, but doesn't have all the nutrients and that ramial wood that Liz was talking about. The hardwood tends to have that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Bird, but we can't be picky when we're getting free chips.
Yeah, it was a huge pile, so I'll find something to do with it.
Right.
I would say the other do or don't with wood chips too is, they're best applied at the top layer, as Liz did in her talk, because they're so carbon rich. If you start to mix them into the soil, they start to rob your nitrogen and other off. If you keep them at the surface, as they break down, they're not going to make a big impact on nitrogen levels and other soil levels.
Okay.
We've found that, having done that now for 18 years, the soil has become so rich, and you build all the mycelium in the soil, all the fungal networks in the soil. And so even in places where we're growing annuals, we have had wood chips very, very close to our plants in the walkways and elsewhere. And we've mixed in little perennial beds. And that soil is full of those white mycorrhizal strands, those fungal strands.
And you don't want that.
No, you do want that.
You do want that.
You do want that. Okay.
Yeah, picture it's like the internet for plants. It's you want fungi surrounding the roots and the root hairs of all your plants, feeding them water, feeding them nutrients, communicating between plants. I know it sounds a little wacky, but it's building the fertility. As Liz talked about, a lot of what we're doing is actually building the soil fertility. And so over time, it gets better and better.
Huh. I think we're going to need another session of this for the advanced conversations.
That's one of the questions
That's one of the questions we'll have. Yeah. What other topics should more detailed kind of versions of this would be helpful? Steve, I'm just curious. Do you have any, as far as white, have you ever used full kind of like white pine wood chips? And have you noticed anything with levels of acidity? Because I know I've used like pine needles and stuff as mulch for blueberries and stuff like that. But have you noticed issues with like the chips itself with acidity?
No, because mostly where we've used them very close to plants, they've been perennial plants.
Yeah.
And we're not mixing them into the soil profile. So
Yeah.
they're breaking down really slowly. So I saw the question from Sarah, and I'm not a good soil tester like Liz advocates for. I am at
Me either.
compost, just keep adding compost, and keep adding comfrey leaves. But we haven't seen signs of issues of like high acidity. So it's a great question. It's a common question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have
Thank you.
from Judith. All right.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay.
I unmuted myself.
It's nice to hear your voice.
Yeah, so I think my question is similar to what you were talking about with, is it Peter? What we've done is we're newbies here. We moved from Reno, Nevada 2 years ago, so this is a whole new challenge for us. And we're building 3 4x8 beds right next to our deck, close to the kitchen, and hopefully we can keep some of the wildlife at bay. But they're only gonna be 12-inch beds, okay? And I wanted, just because they're gonna be on the lawn, I would like to just put down cardboard, and then we've ordered some composted soil actually, and I have some compost I'm making to also add to that, and then mulch on top. But I'm feeling like that's not going to be enough depth. I mean, with tomatoes and are we going to be able to use that? Or
That's a good question.
does it take a certain period of time for the cardboard to break down so that roots can penetrate it? I don't know how this works.
What do you think, Liz? I have an answer, but I want to hear what you have to say.
I was just gonna say you just did this last year.
Yeah, and it
right?
worked.
And it worked
We're
great.
doing it right now.
So yeah, he just
Oh,
Steve
he just did this
built,
last year. Oh, I see.
Yep,
Okay.
he just built raised beds last year using pretty much the same method that you described. And I went over to his house, and they were all filled with lots of amazing crops, including squash.
Brilliant.
Some of the ones.
Okay.
Yeah, we had an area that that was very poor soil.
Uh-huh.
We didn't do a job with our kind of no-till methods, and it takes a long time to build soil. And so if you have an area, as Liz said, that's kind of a tough spot, if you identify it as a problem spot, even if it's convenient for other reasons, it may not be a good garden spot. And so in this location, it looked like raised beds would be better. So Judith, I did it the same way you described. And the only difference as far as carrots, we got pelletized carrots that were really kind of a smaller variety.
Oh, okay.
That
And
helped.
they worked, and that helped. Okay. All right. Rutabagas?
Definitely put that cardboard layer down and set those raised
Yeah.
frames on top of it, or
Okay.
fill the inside with the cardboard.
Okay. We'll go for it.
That's awesome. That'll be exciting.
I am excited. This is great, by the way, having this.
Oh, good.
I've got more questions, but let somebody else take over.
Do you see the next question we have here, Liz? From
Oh man, this one's I love this one. There's so many answers to it. So we're looking to incorporate more edible perennials. Do you have any suggestions on what to plant? To me, berries of any kind, and I'm not sure, Sarah and Ben, what you already have, but as far as there are so many different types of fruiting shrubs that I think are really great for humans, that we really like them, whether it's blueberries or raspberries. There's also some other kind of unique ones that I really like for other purposes, like chokeberry is actually one of my favorite shrubs. The berries are edible. Like I've made a chokeberry jam before, but they're amazing for wildlife. And I just like the look of the shrub as far as kind of like a landscaping plant. I think it's kind of undervalued in a lot of ways as a landscaping plant for its beauty. And then elderberry, I think, is another really good one. as far as beautiful plant, big showy white flowers, incredibly medicinal berry, and you can use it, and that can be part of your kind of homesteading routine as far as making elderberry syrup or other types of products, elderberry tincture, that you can use for cold and flu prevention every year. So those types of plants are really fun. And then also some vines I think are exciting too, because if you build them with a trellis, they can provide shade. It can be a sitting area, and you can incorporate it into a larger kind of garden design. So grapes, hardy kiwi, even things like New Zealand spinach, which is like a perennial spinach, which I myself have not grown, but it's one of my top perennial vegetables that I really want to experiment with growing. I don't know if you've grown that before, Steve, but that's another one that I would recommend. I'm excited about trying it out. And then rhubarb, asparagus, Jerusalem artichoke are some other ones I would recommend.
I think this is one of our topics for another, because I think what Sarah's asking goes back to kind of your goal setting. And
Yes.
Thinking about what your site's going to be like, and are you talking about larger perennial trees, fruit
Yes.
crops?
That too.
A fairly small area where you want to start. But you rattled off some really good ones.
Yeah, you're right. I think that could be its own topic.
Yeah, this is Sarah and Ben Velasky. Yeah, those are great suggestions. And it's great to see you present. This is awesome.
Awesome.
So yeah, we were looking at our property the other day, and we have kind of a number of, we have an acre, and we have, some shady spots and some sunny spots. We also have some spots that where the previous owner had, it was previously a forest, and they cut down like probably 10 really big trees, and it's been not a forest for about maybe 5-6 years. But we were kind of curious as to what the soil was probably like in that area, and if like it would be wise to plant a fruit tree or some fruit, in that area, because we have our annual garden beds on the other side of the property, but we didn't want to, go out and buy a nice heirloom apple tree and then put it down there and then have it not do very well. So, yeah, I guess it sounds like it's more of like just kind of seeing where the sun's at and doing some
Yeah. And if it's, and I haven't seen your property, so I'm not, not having that knowledge is a disadvantage. But if it's an area that is wooded and some of the larger trees in that area have been cut down so that it has let light in, I think there's opportunity for a variety of kind of like forest edibles to be incorporated in there. Granted, if it's less wooded than what I'm picturing, then it could be different. But things like ostrich ferns and stuff like that can actually be planted in an area that has a little bit more light. But is essentially a more forested area of your property. So we've actually been working with a client on that specifically recently. But again, let me know if you ever want to send photos. We can chat more later.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to hear your voice, Ben. And one of the risks we run is trying to give you advice without knowing your site.
Right, totally.
But if it had been a forest, then that's largely probably forest soil. It has those fungal networks and would be very receptive to a tree. And just digging a couple test pits to see what the soil's like and how big an area you'd have to dig out in order to establish a fruit tree would be good. And you guys have solar on your house over there in Vermont?
We do. Yep. Yeah. So the area that I'm talking about, it's not like, a patch out of a dense forest. It's kind of, I'd say it's filtered sunlight, probably gets maybe 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight a day. And then it's kind of shaded in the afternoon and late afternoon.
Okay. I was just mentioning, because knowing that you're a solar household, in thinking about planting any trees, be thinking about how tall the tree will get and if it will end up creating a problem with your kind of solar window.
Right.
And just knowing your lifestyle, I wanted to mention that.
Yep, that's
sorry. I just want to mention about the choke berry. I've had good luck with that in 2 locations in my yard, and one only gets about a half a day of sun. And it is a beautiful blooming. Yeah, the birds love it, and I have to chase them away to get some of the berries. They're kind of like cherries, right? I think I'm thinking of the right thing. It has a pit in it. The chokeberry has a pit.
I don't eat them raw. I've only ever eaten them processed.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Oh, they're tart, but they're good. But it
When you
works
have-
well in a half a day of sun.
When you have some this year, Sandra, let us know. We'll come take a look.
Yeah.
Be good to see them.
Oh, okay. I'll let you know.
Yeah. So we can take some more questions. I want to put in a plug for a couple things before we lose anybody else. We've lost a couple people. We are at the kind of hour mark, and so we knew that would likely happen. But a couple of things, we are open to other topics. So I've taken down a couple that were mentioned tonight. If you can think of others that you want to email us or put in the chat feature or share before you get off, we're happy to take them down and we'll see if we can build one or more other talks. I know Sandra just did a talk yesterday and she has a couple of additional kind of related topics that she's working on as well. So we'll work together to see how to address this. I also want to let you know that there's another session through the Resilience Roundtable on Friday night. Peter Adams, who was actually on here with us for a while tonight, will be moderating and kind of hosting. And it's actually with our friend Mo the Clown. And so it's going to be more entertainment and it's going to be at 7. I think Mo told us, Sandra, that like May 1st is the day that new clowns were brought out to the circus or something. So it just kind of worked that our local character of a clown was willing to entertainment, through Zoom on Friday. There will be some others being announced through that website. And so the Parade newsletter and Facebook and wherever you heard about this, we'll be advertising other topics as well. Other questions? Let's see. More about perennials.
Awesome.
We're getting some good topics.
Yep. Yeah, these are great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I just unmuted this. I'm like typing my question, but it's probably easier to just say it.
No, please, Hannah. That'd be good.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm so glad you guys are here. This is super cool. I actually have 2 questions. One of them is in regards to I'm trying to get into no-tilling and building the soil, but right now I'm working with shallow, super rocky. So I'm trying to till out as much rocks as I can. But knowing that roots keep the soil healthy, but they're also kind of getting in the way for plants. And I'm not talking just about like big tree roots, but uprooting my plants at the end of the season when I harvest them. Last year, I just kind of yanked them out and chopped them up a little bit to put in the compost, but I don't know if I should just be cutting it down and like layer the soil on top this year for next year to improve it better, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Steve, do you have an answer for that? I'm still thinking.
So I think there are a lot of different ways you could do it, Hannah. The way we've done it in our no-till beds has been to cut things as low to the ground as we can and just let them rot in place.
That's what I've done too.
Often what I'll do is at the beginning of the next season, after the soil's dried out enough, I'll come in with a pitchfork and kind of crack the soil and just you're kind of aerating and lifting. And a lot of those roots, if they're really big and they haven't broken down much over the course of the winter and they show themselves, I might take them and throw them in the compost. But if they're really small, they're adding a lot of organic material.
Yeah, like I would say for me at least, the roots that I have done that with, as in pulled them out, is like Brussels sprouts.
Those are
like
great.
even this year, like I was like, wow, these Brussels sprout roots are still really dense. So I did what Steve did and took them out. Most of the other, like most of everything else, like the tomatoes and stuff, were totally kind of broken down already. So.
That's what I had most of last year, was really just like tomatoes and peppers. And the peppers I could have just left. They were really shallow. And the tomatoes were pretty shallow too, but they also were bigger clumps than what I was expecting. So since it was shallow, I wanted to get rid of them. But I think coming into this next year, to cut them down and layer on top of it will be beneficial in the long run. My other question, if I can pop one in real quick, is about hardening off seedlings. And so is wind and strengthening the primary reason for hardening them off? And my curiosity about this is because I have them inside right now where it's really sunny and nice. And then a lot of these are going to be going into the greenhouse where it's almost usually even warmer out in the greenhouse than it is inside right now. And we don't have a lot of ventilation in this greenhouse. And so should I harden them off in the greenhouse or outside and then put them in there? Or will that kind of shock them to then get a lot warmer in the greenhouse after hardening them?
So when I was I worked on a farm in Virginia, and so we grew all of our plants by seed in a greenhouse, and we still brought them out of the greenhouse to harden off.
Oh, that's cool.
Yep, and that worked really well because essentially all you're doing is preparing them to go into the soil in the outside world.
Yeah.
And so in a couple hour increments, I think it only made them stronger.
All right, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you.
I think Hannah, your greenhouse is pretty new. You guys have just been building it.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever done anything in a greenhouse, and the first time that either of us have really built anything. So we're learning as we go along. Like, we're gonna have to get something to roll up the sides because the windows that we put in aren't really adequate ventilation. So it's really humid in there. It's definitely a learning process. I think it's gonna be peppers mostly in there, tomatoes, but still figuring all that out.
Awesome.
That's it. I mean, I think you'll see pretty soon, even as we get into late May, and you're in Maine.
No, I'm actually in Lincoln, just a little bit.
Oh, you are?
Bit north
You're right
of
here.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think you'll see that even by late May, it'll be a hothouse. It'll be really kind of primed for tomatoes and peppers and stuff like that.
Oh, that'll be great because I got a lot of them.
And then you'll be set up, as Liz was talking about, kind of like successional planting. Come late August, you should start thinking about planting fall greens, and you'll have green.
Yeah, that's something I didn't even think of with the succession because I've got lettuce and carrots going too. So last year it was like everything harvest all at once. So if I can space it out better, that's genius.
Yeah, I love succession planning in that way. It makes it so much more like fruitful.
Yeah, definitely. Good use of words.
Question from Sandra about putting weeds in the compost pile, Liz.
So my thought is, it's fine. It depends on if they've gone to seed, I guess. If they have gone to seed, I would make sure that it was hot enough that the compost pile was hot enough that it killed them. Which, that just depends on your own composting method too. And if that's something that you're not going to do, whether it's actually measure that or not, then maybe you don't throw them in there when they've gone to seed. But
okay, because I just read that recently, and I thought that must be why my garden has so many weeds and my compost. Because I just get so discouraged halfway through the summer. It's just so weedy. I can't even find my plants sometimes. But this year I'm recommitting. That's why I thought maybe the bark pieces would help. But But my compost is in the shade. Is that a major no-no? Should I be finding a new spot for it?
Steve, what do you think?
It'll just cook slower. It won't high temperatures. So if you do put weed seeds in,
exactly.
Pulling little weeds out of the garden over the next few weeks and months. Just keep throwing them into the compost. I mean, what's a weed anyway? A lot of them are medicinal. A lot of them are edible.
Right.
Yeah. Plant in a location where you didn't anticipate having a plant.
Right.
And so I would continue to do that. But if you see it really start to go to full seed, as Liz said, maybe skip it then.
Okay.
And I think for you and for Judith, using straw, so instead of hay, which has seeds, using straw as a mulcher on some of your plants, like Liz was talking about, like a lighter mulching material will also help. And then you can also use like cover crops. You can plant other things to take up spaces between plants. So you can experiment with a couple things and see what works in your site.
Yeah. Because oftentimes weeds are always an issue, but oftentimes they'll, like for me, like if I have a bed of carrots or something like that and I pull the carrots out and then that bed is empty for a little while, then it's like, oh my God, they overrun that bed. So yeah, if you sprinkle a cover crop like buckwheat or something like that, it'll grow, which buckwheat grows really fast and it's a nice kind of white flower. And it'll grow up and it'll densely cover the soil. Like there's not really going to be much weeds growing up in there, and it'll just kind of create, again, a nice cover and just suppress that weed growth from happening in the first place. Because once you get them, I agree, once they start and they're established, it can be really hard to tame them down again. The other
Yes.
thing that I've been doing a lot of too is just every year that goes by, I'm planting denser. So like with every year, I'm trying to plant my rows and like the different seeds that I'm like direct sowing or even transplanting a little bit denser to try to just reduce the amount of space between things. And again, sometimes that can work, sometimes it can't, but I've been like testing that every year because I think it does work if you can create kind of that living mulch cover by just densely planting things.
Yeah,
That's
pretty forgiving.
That's great advice.
Get dense. I do see Judith got a question, Liz, about tomatoes and start to get some of those yellow leaves. So thoughts on young tomato seedlings?
I'm not the expert on young tomato seedlings, to tell you the truth. Tomatoes are one thing that I will buy transplants of. I hate to admit, but because for me, like it's never been yellow leaves as a problem, but it's more been leggy. They've been so leggy, and so they've just been so weak when I put them in the ground. Steve, have you started tomato seedlings from plants or from seeds and had the yellow leaves come up before? Because I know that sometimes that can mean some type of disease. It seems they're so young though when they get it seems a little odd, but
right. Judith, is it the whole plant that's yellow or just some of the bottom leaves? You're muted. Hold on. See if we can help you out. Still muted. Hold on. Sometimes if I'm trying to, there you go.
There we go. Okay. No, they've already put the second leaves on. I don't know what you call them. So it's the first leaves that they had, and only on some of them, not all the plants.
Often
so the cotyledons. So the cotyledons, which are the first leaves, the not true leaves, will usually just wither off and break off.
They will. Well, maybe that's what's happening then.
Yeah. So that would be fine.
Maybe I'm a helicopter parent.
Yeah, that would be a normal thing, I would say.
Okay. All right.
Yep. No, that's great. It's a great question.
But your question about watering too.
Yeah.
Tomatoes don't like to be watered.
Well, I've read that online since I started searching what's wrong with my tomato plants, seedlings. Yeah.
Yeah. So just water their feet or soak them. Take the seedlings and put them in water so they can soak up.
Okay. Yeah, I will do that from now on. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other burning questions before we wrap for tonight? Okay, not seeing any. I would like to thank Liz. Thank you very much, Liz. I think you provided a really wonderful discussion, and I would like to thank everyone that was here and those that have since left. I'll be sending this to Peter. He's already asked me for it. I'll be sending the recording to Peter. It'll go up on the Resilience Roundtable website, so you'll have access if you want to go back and go through and see any of Liz's slides again. You can also look in the chat function, and our emails are there if you want to do that before you leave. And if you email us, we'd be happy to send you a copy of the PowerPoint slides. Any closing remarks, Liz?
I would thank you all for being here. Yeah, I love just chatting with people and like geeking out on gardening techniques. So this is in and of itself just like Q&A, informal kind of discussion. What works for you? What works for you? What doesn't work? I love all of that. So hopefully we get more opportunities to do that in the future.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.